August 19, 1944. The desert outside Fort Bliss, Texas seemed to breathe heat. The air shimmered like glass, each gust of wind carrying dust that bit into the skin and stung the eyes. Beyond the wire fence, a transport truck roared through, the glare, its engine whining under the strain of the climb. Inside the steel box, 37 German women sat shoulder to shoulder, exhausted, silent, and bracing for whatever awaited them on the other side of the world. They had been captured during the Allied push through France, taken first to England and now across an entire ocean to this foreign, blinding land. Their uniforms, once pressed in gray, were now faded to ash. The insignias on their sleeves no longer held meaning. They were prisoners, defeated pieces of an empire collapsing an ocean away. Among them sat Elsa Bauer, 22 years old, her back straight despite the rattling floor beneath her boots. She had served as a communications operator for the Luftwaffe, repeating coded messages she no longer believed in. Her hands clutched a creased photograph of her younger sister, Anna, taken before the bombings began, before hunger hollowed her face. Elsa's eyes lingered on that picture as if by holding it tightly enough, she could keep her sister safe across the sea. No one spoke. Sweat trickled down their necks, soaking the collars of their uniforms. The truck jolted to a stop. For a moment, there was nothing and no orders, no shouting, and just the ringing hum of the desert itself. Then came the sound of boots heavy and measured, followed by the sharp creak of the latch. Sunlight exploded through the open doors. The women squinted, raising trembling hands to their faces. On the other side stood a group of American soldiers, men in khaki, sunburned, lean, and curious. Their rifles hung casually at their sides, their eyes neither hostile nor kind, just uncertain. At their front was Colonel Alan Whitmore, tall, square-jawed, the kind of man whose authority didn't need to be shouted. His expression was all discipline until he saw them, these weary, frightened women who barely looked like soldiers anymore. Something in his face softened, though he didn't speak it aloud. Behind him stood Lieutenant James Carter, his uniform pressed but his hat tilted slightly off-center, a habit born more from habit than rebellion. He watched the women climb down one by one, careful not to stumble. They were supposed to be enemies, yet as he looked at them, pale, exhausted, and trembling under the desert sun, he couldn't make the word enemy fit. When one woman, Marta Klein, faltered, her knees buckling from heat, Carter stepped forward instinctively. He unscrewed his canteen and offered it to her without a word. For a moment, time seemed to hesitate, the guards watching, the prisoners frozen. Marta's eyes flicked between the canteen and the man offering it. Her training screamed not to trust it, not to believe. But thirst was stronger than fear. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. "Danke," she whispered. Carter only nodded. That small exchange, a few seconds in the endless heat, shifted something invisible but immense. It was the first moment in that camp where humanity, not war, spoke louder than orders. The women were led through the gates into a compound of barracks built from rough pine, their roofs sagging slightly under the weight of the sun. It was not what they had imagined. There were no cages, no screaming guards, just open yards, a small infirmary, and a mess hall that smelled faintly of flour and coffee. Elsa followed quietly, her heart still racing. She noticed the oddest things, a garden plot near the fence, a guard's laughter carried by the wind, the strange sound of cicadas. She had expected hatred. Instead, everything here felt disorientingly ordinary. That first evening, as the desert cooled into violet dusk, the women sat in their barracks listening to the hum of insects. No one spoke for a long time. The walls creaked in the wind. Then Lena Vogel, a nurse from Munich, murmured softly, "It's too quiet." Elsa understood exactly what she meant. The quiet wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that followed disbelief. Over the next few days, the strangeness continued. The guards were polite, sometimes even smiling. The food was unthinkable: eggs, real butter, and coffee that smelled like home. Elsa stared at her first breakfast in stunned silence, her stomach tightening instead of growling. She had spent years rationing crusts of bread and thin soup. Now she was handed abundance on a tray by the very people she'd been taught to hate. She tried to eat, but every bite felt like theft. Across the room, Lieutenant Carter watched quietly from the corner. He didn't speak German, but he could read faces, confusion, guilt, disbelief. He had seen combat before being reassigned to Fort Bliss, and the haunted look in their eyes reminded him of his own reflection after the Italian campaign. War, he thought, left the same scars no matter the uniform. That night, Elsa wrote in her small notebook, her handwriting small and deliberate. I do not understand these Americans. We are prisoners, yet they feed us better than we have eaten in years. If this is defeat, it feels kinder than victory. The desert outside hummed softly under the stars. The fences shimmered in moonlight, silver and still. Somewhere beyond, a coyote cried, the sound rising and fading into the night. Elsa lay, awake, listening, feeling the strange weight of freedom inside captivity. Something had begun to shift, and though no one could see it yet, this quiet camp in the middle of nowhere was about to become the stage for one of the most unlikely transformations of the war. By the second week, the unbearable Texas heat had become another kind of enemy, silent, relentless, and impossible to fight. The German women learned to move slower, to cover their heads with scarves and rags, to drink water constantly. Their pale skin burned easily, and even in the shade, the air seemed to shimmer with fire. The guards, mostly Texans and farm boys, from nearby towns, looked like they were carved from the sun itself, tanned, steady, unbothered by the furnace around them. They joked among themselves in easy voices, their accents stretching words like warm syrup. The women didn't understand the language, but they recognized something in the tone. It wasn't cruelty. It was life, ordinary and unguarded. Elsa Bauer spent her mornings cleaning laundry with Lena Vogel and Marta Klein, their hands red and raw from scrubbing under the metal taps. The Americans provided real soap, white bars that smelled faintly of citrus, a small luxury that reminded them of a world long gone. Elsa often found herself wondering why the enemy would offer such comforts. At night, she would write in her notebook by the light of a dim bulb. Every kindness here feels heavy, as if it demands payment in shame. The days blurred together. They worked, ate, and tried to understand the strange rhythm of captivity. The guards never shouted. The camp commandant, Colonel Whitmore, visited occasionally, speaking in short, measured tones through the translator, Corporal Romano. A kind-faced man with a half-German grandmother who bridged the gap between both worlds. It was Romano who explained their work schedules, who taught them English words in exchange for German ones. His presence softened the air between captors and captives. Still, mistrust lingered, invisible but always there, like the desert dust that never fully settled. Then, one afternoon in mid-September, something unusual happened. The women returned from their morning duties to find the mess hall strangely fragrant. A warm, sugary scent filled the air, so unfamiliar that for a moment none of them could place it. Inside, the American cooks were bustling about, grinning, setting trays of golden pastries on the tables. Corporal Romano approached the confused women, wiping sweat from his forehead. "A treat," he said with a smile, switching to halting German. "A gift from the local farmers. You'll see." Lieutenant Carter stood near the doorway, watching quietly as the first trays were uncovered. The scent grew stronger, butter, sugar, something fruity. The women murmured uncertainly, exchanging wary glances. It felt like a dream, or worse, a trap dressed as kindness. Private Cooper, the youngest of the guards, beamed proudly. "Peach cobbler," he announced, gesturing with an exaggerated flourish as if unveiling treasure. His accent twisted the words, making them sound almost foreign themselves. Romano translated, "Pfirsich, Kuchen." The room fell silent. The Germans had not tasted fruit, real fruit, in years. To them, sweetness belonged to another lifetime, something whispered about by children and remembered only in dreams. Elsa stared at the dish in front of her, her heart pounding. Carter noticed the hesitation and stepped forward. He took a spoonful himself, blew gently on the steam, and tasted it. See, he said lightly, smiling. Not poison, just Texas hospitality. The translator repeated his words, and the phrase hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in warmth. Still, no one moved. It was Marta, the same woman who had once accepted Carter's canteen, who finally stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she lifted a small portion onto her plate. She looked around the room and at the guards waiting, at her fellow prisoners staring, then took a bite. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then her eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly and a sound escaped her, half a laugh, half a sob. It was the taste that undid her. Sweet, warm, impossible. She had forgotten what comfort could taste like. The others followed hesitantly, and soon the silence dissolved into quiet disbelief. Some laughed nervously, others cried softly. Elsa took her first bite and felt tears prick her eyes before she even understood why. It wasn't just the food. It was what it meant. That something so tender, so utterly unnecessary in war could be given freely. Across the hall, Lieutenant Carter leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. For the first time since the women's arrival, the camp was filled not with suspicion, but with the fragile warmth of shared humanity. Romano moved between tables, translating fragments of conversation. Very good, one woman said shyly. Too sweet, another whispered, smiling for the first time. The guards chuckled quietly, pretending not to notice the tears. That afternoon became a quiet legend inside Fort Bliss, a story retold over evening patrols and whispered in the barracks. The day the enemy women tasted American peaches and forgot for a fleeting moment that there was a war. When Elsa returned to her bunk that evening, the sun was sinking low, staining the desert orange and gold. She sat by the window, the smell of cobbler still clinging faintly to her hands. In her notebook, she wrote one simple line. Perhaps mercy tastes like peaches. Outside, a warm wind carried the scent of dust and faraway rain. The camp was quiet again, but it no longer felt hollow. Something invisible had shifted, not surrender, not victory, something deeper. It was the beginning of understanding. October arrived like a sigh of mercy. The Texas heat eased just enough that the women could breathe again, though the air still shimmered faintly each afternoon. The camp had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like normal life. Work, meals, rest, and the occasional burst of laughter when the translator, Corporal Romano, mispronounced a German word and turned it into something absurd. For the first time since capture, the women were no longer bracing for cruelty. They had clean beds, regular food, and even a small garden where they tended to tomatoes and herbs. Some days the camp almost felt like a distant cousin of home, quiet, contained, predictable. But that illusion was about to fracture. It began one morning when Colonel Whitmore entered the mess hall carrying a large canvas bag. The guards stood straighter, their expressions solemn. The prisoners fell into silence, forks suspended mid-air. Through the translator, Whitmore announced, "The Red Cross has established contact with Europe. Today we distribute letters from your families." The words dropped into the air like stones into still water. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then one by one, names were called, and trembling hands reached out for fragile envelopes stamped with distant postmarks. Elsa Bauer received one. The handwriting on the front made her heart stumble. Her mother's. She carried it back to her bunk as though it were made of glass. For almost an hour she couldn't open it. When she finally did, the paper smelled faintly of smoke and dampness. Her mother's words were rushed, uneven, lines that bled into one another, desperate to fit too much into too little space. They spoke of bombings in Hamburg, of nights spent huddled in basements with strangers, of ration lines that stretched for hours and ended with nothing. Her younger sister Anna, now 16, had been conscripted to work in a munitions factory. She coughs all the time, the letter said. There is dust in the air, the kind that makes people disappear. Elsa read the letter twice before realizing she had stopped breathing. The page blurred. Her hands shook so violently she had to fold it, press it flat against her chest and whisper to herself in German. Ich bin hier. Ich bin sicher. Aber warum? I am here, I am safe. But why? All around her, the others were reading too. Gasps, muffled cries, trembling whispers. The room became a quiet storm of grief. Lena Vogel's letter told of her husband's death in a firebombing. Marta Klein's childhood home no longer existed. Ingrid, who had laughed the loudest since arriving, sat motionless for nearly an hour before tearing her letter into pieces and throwing them into the trash. Not every woman received mail. For those without letters, silence became its own cruelty. The absence of words felt heavier than bad news. It meant nothing was left to reach them. That night, the mess hall was subdued. The sound of utensils scraping against tin trays seemed unnaturally loud. Dessert went untouched. Sweet cornbread still warm, abandoned on every plate. Lieutenant Carter noticed. He'd seen fear before, the kind that flares up and burns out. But this was something quieter, deeper, a kind of spiritual collapse. He watched Elsa push her food aside, her shoulders rigid, her eyes distant. Later that evening, as the sun bled orange across the yard, Carter found Corporal Romano outside the barracks. "They're falling apart," Carter said quietly. Romano nodded. "The letters? They've split their world in two. Back home, it's hell. Here, they're safe. That's not something you can live with easily." Carter frowned. "They're punishing themselves for surviving." "Wouldn't you?" Romano asked gently. For days after the mail delivery, the camp moved like a place under mourning. The laughter was gone, the garden untended. Work became automatic, mechanical. The women moved through their tasks as if trying to earn forgiveness through exhaustion. Elsa stopped eating sweets entirely. When the kitchen offered pie or pudding, she passed it to others. Lena worked double shifts in the infirmary, cleaning the same shelves again and again. Marta wrote letters home she knew would never reach anyone. The guilt settled like dust, always there, coating everything. Lieutenant Carter tried to bridge the gap, speaking to them through the translator. "You are not responsible for what is happening back home," he said one afternoon, standing awkwardly in the yard as they worked. "War takes everything, but it doesn't make you less human," Romano translated, but his voice faltered halfway. The words felt too soft, too foreign to believe. That night, Elsa dreamed of her sister again, Anna standing amid rubble, coughing, calling her name through smoke. When Elsa reached for her, her hands passed through air. She woke up gasping. In the faint dawn light, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Kindness feels heavier than hunger." The next morning, Private Cooper, the same guard who'd once offered peaches, noticed the untouched bread Elsa had hidden under her cot. He didn't scold her. Instead, he knelt down and spoke softly, pointing to the loaf. "Tomorrow," he said in slow English, then again in broken German, "more bread comes. Every day, more." Elsa stared at him, unblinking. The words didn't make sense at first. More was not a word she associated with survival, but Cooper just smiled and stood, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and a single truth she wasn't ready to accept. In this desert prison, the enemy was teaching her how to live again. Days bled into weeks and the rhythm of camp life returned, but it wasn't the same. Something invisible had shifted after the letters. The air carried a weight that not even the dry Texas wind could scatter. The guards noticed it first. The laughter that used to drift from the women's barracks at night had gone silent. Even the sound of the harmonica one of them used to play vanished. Instead, there was only the quiet rustle of pages, women writing by candlelight, not letters of hope, but confessions that no one would ever read. Lieutenant Carter couldn't shake the image of Elsa's pale face as she read her mother's words. He saw it every morning during inspection, that hollow calm people wear when they've stopped expecting the world to make sense. One afternoon, he stopped by the infirmary where Lena Vogel worked. She stood at a basin, scrubbing surgical instruments that were already spotless. Her movements were sharp, repetitive, punishing. "You'll wear the metal thin," Carter said gently. Lena froze, not understanding the words but catching the tone. Through Corporal Novak, the translation came softly. "He says you work too much," she answered without looking up. "Work is the only thing that doesn't lie." Carter didn't reply. He just nodded, recognizing the truth in her words, and how much pain it concealed. Over the next days, Carter and Novak made quiet efforts to ease the tension. They organized reading lessons again, brought new blankets from storage, even allowed music in the evenings. But the women responded with polite silence. Gratitude had turned into something painful, like warmth on frostbitten skin. Marta Klein tried to smile when the guard spoke to her. She didn't want to seem ungrateful, but every kindness, every small mercy, was a reminder of what her family lacked back home. She would take her tray of food, real food, eggs and bread, and imagine her mother dividing a single potato 3 ways. The taste of abundance became unbearable. The guilt became contagious. Even among the guards, Private Samuel Reed, who had once joked and shared stories about his family's peach farm, now found himself quieter, unsure how to act around the prisoners. "Feels wrong, sir," he admitted to Carter one evening. "We eat the same meals, breathe the same air, and still they look at us like we're ghosts haunting their conscience." Carter sighed. "Maybe we are." That night he wrote in his logbook, not a military entry, but a personal one. "The enemy does not hate us. She envies us our peace of mind. I'm starting to envy her strength." As October deepened, Texas nights grew cooler. The guards allowed small fires outside the barracks. Around them, women gathered quietly, not talking, just sitting close for warmth. Sometimes one would hum a song from home, soft and haunting, the kind of melody that carried grief better than words. Carter began to linger near the fence during those evenings. He told himself it was duty, but he knew better. There was something about their silence that drew him, something human he couldn't turn away from. It was Elsa who broke that silence first. One night she approached the fence, her face half hidden in the orange glow of the fire. "Lieutenant Carter," she said, her English halting but clear. Why are you kind?" Carter hesitated. The question startled him more than gunfire ever could. He searched for an answer that wouldn't sound foolish. "Because hate's heavy," he said finally, "and we've all been carrying it long enough." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "In Germany, hate is easier. Feels like duty. And here?" he asked. "Here." She paused, looking at the dark sky. "Here it feels like shame." Neither spoke again. But from that night on, the tension between them softened. Not in romance, but in recognition. Two people on opposite sides of a war, both discovering how heavy mercy could feel. As November came, the Red Cross brought more letters, and again, more pain. Some women received word that family members had died. Others learned nothing at all. This time, Colonel Whitmore gathered the guards before distribution. "Remember," he said, "we're not just managing prisoners. We're managing grief." The letters were handed out with quiet dignity. No one cried aloud this time. Grief had settled too deep for sound. Marta's letter came from her neighbor in Bremen. It said only, "Your house is gone. Your mother taken, no one knows where." She folded the paper neatly, placed it in her pocket, and walked outside. Elsa found her sitting by the fence an hour later, staring into the distance where the desert met the sky. "There is nothing left," Marta whispered in German. Elsa sat beside her, unsure what to say. After a long silence, she murmured, "Then maybe we build something new." Marta turned, her face pale and streaked with dust. "Here?" Elsa didn't answer, but her eyes said yes. Inside the mess hall, Private Reed and Corporal Novak watched from the window. Reed shook his head. "I keep thinking of my ma," he said. "If she saw them like that, just girls, not enemies, she'd send every pie in Texas." Novak smiled faintly. Maybe that's not such a bad idea. And just like that, from an offhand remark, from one small act of compassion, something new began to take shape. It was a Thursday morning when something unusual stirred inside the camp. The Texas sun had only just risen, but there was already a strange energy running through the air, a quiet anticipation that none of the prisoners could explain. From the kitchen, the faint smell of something sweet drifted across the yard. For months, the women had grown used to the predictable scents of boiled vegetables, bread, and coffee that tasted mostly like burnt water, but this was different, rich, buttery, with a sharp hint of fruit that didn't belong in a prison camp. Lena Vogel was the first to notice the guards behaving differently. They moved with a lightness she hadn't seen before, laughing softly, sharing small conspiratorial glances. Something was coming, something she couldn't name. By midday, even Elsa Bauer felt it, that uneasy curiosity that prickled in the chest when hope tried to wake up again after too long a sleep. The lunch bell rang. The women lined up in silence, expecting the usual fare. But when they stepped into the mess hall, the scene stopped them cold. Every table glowed with the light of the Texas afternoon, and on each one rested golden pies still steaming, their crusts glistening with sugar. The smell was intoxicating. Warm peaches, cinnamon, and the unmistakable scent of butter baked into perfection. Private Samuel Reed stood proudly behind the counter, his grin uncontainable. "Fresh peaches," he said, gesturing with a broad wave of his arm. "From my family's farm out near Lubbock. Best crop we've had in years." The translator, Corporal Peter Novak, struggled for the right word. "Pfirsichtorte," he said finally, the German word for peach cake, but it sounded inadequate, too plain for something that looked like sunlight turned into food. The women froze. No one moved forward. The air was thick with disbelief. Marta Klein whispered under her breath, "This is a test." Lena nodded tightly. "Everything is a test." Elsa's gaze swept across the room, the pies, the smiling guards, the absurd gentleness of it all, and she felt her throat close. For years, food had been currency, weapon, and salvation. Nothing good came without a price. Lieutenant James Carter stepped forward, understanding their hesitation before anyone said a word. He picked up a slice of pie, took a slow, deliberate bite, and smiled, not mockingly, but softly, like someone remembering home. "It's safe," he said through Novak. "It's not a trick. It's just pie." Still no one moved. The moment stretched, and then, as it had been before, it was Marta who broke the silence. She stepped forward, her hands trembling, eyes darting between Carter and Reed. She accepted a plate, sat at the nearest table, and lifted the fork with the care of someone defusing a bomb. The first bite changed everything. Her eyes widened, her breath caught, and for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stop. The taste was unreal. Soft peaches soaked in their own syrup, crust that flaked like pastry from a dream. It was sweetness resurrected after years of ash and hunger. A quiet gasp escaped her lips. A sound that wasn't fear or pain or duties, it was pleasure. And in that instant, the wall of silence cracked. Elsa followed next, then Lena, then the others. Soon the entire hall was filled with the faint clatter of forks and the quiet, stunned sound of people remembering joy. The American guards watched without saying much. Reed leaned against the counter, his smile gentle now, less pride and more relief. "See?" he murmured to Novak. "They just needed a little sweetness." But Novak shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "They needed permission to feel human again." At one of the long tables, Elsa ate slowly, tasting every bite as if afraid the flavor might disappear. She thought of her mother's letter. The hunger, the fear, and guilt rose up thick and bitter. But then she looked around the room at women smiling through tears and realized something important. They weren't celebrating. They were remembering what life was supposed to taste like. Across from her, Lena carefully wrapped half her slice in a napkin. When Elsa asked why, she whispered, "For later, so I can remember this wasn't a dream." Carter watched the scene unfold, a strange tightness in his chest. In that mess hall, once just another building in another camp, he saw something he hadn't seen since the war began. Forgiveness. Not spoken, not even understood, but alive, fragile, and real. When the meal ended, the women carried their plates back with quiet reverence. Some murmured soft thank yous, others simply nodded, unable to find the words. Outside, the Texas sky burned gold as the sun began to set. From somewhere in the camp, a harmonica began to play, hesitant at first, then steady, filling the air with a tune that was neither German nor American. It was something in between. Elsa stood near the fence, holding the last bite of her pie. She turned to Carter, who stood watching from a distance. "Lieutenant," she said softly, "this day, it will stay with us." Carter nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It should," he said. "Some days deserve to be remembered." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of peaches, sweet, fleeting, and impossible to forget. That night, for the first time in months, the women sang. Not loud, not cheerful, but real. By late October, the Texas sun had finally eased its relentless grip on the camp. The air turned gentler, carrying the dry smell of mesquite and dust, and with it came a fragile calm that everyone mistook for peace. The women had settled into something resembling routine. Days passed with work, quiet meals, and small kindnesses exchanged with guards who no longer felt like strangers. But that fragile balance shattered the morning the mail truck arrived. It came rumbling through the gates like a messenger from another world, one the women had nearly stopped believing in. On its side was the faded red cross that made every heart in the yard stop beating. For the first time since their capture, letters had come from home. Colonel Bennett called an assembly in the mess hall. The air inside was heavy, the silence taut as he held up a canvas sack filled with envelopes. Thin, creased, some stained by salt or dirt. "These," he said slowly, "have come through Switzerland. The Red Cross worked a miracle to get them here." Corporal Novak read out the names one by one. Each call struck like a drumbeat. Joy and dread tangled in a single sound. Some women gasped when their names were called. Others lowered their heads, knowing none would come. When Lena Vogel stepped forward to take her letter, her hands shook so badly that the paper rattled audibly. The envelope was addressed in her mother's familiar script, though the handwriting looked weaker, almost fading into the page. She carried it back to her bunk and sat staring at it for nearly an hour before daring to open it. When she finally did, the scent of damp and smoke rose from the paper, the scent of home reduced to ash. Her mother wrote of ration lines that stretched for blocks, of nights spent in basements listening to sirens that never seemed to stop. "Your sister Frida is gone to a munitions factory," the letter said. "She works long hours and sleeps on the floor. We have no butter, no eggs, no soap, but we are alive. Alive." The word tore through Lena like glass. She folded the letter once, twice, then pressed it against her chest until the ink smudged into her skin. At the far end of the barracks, Elsa Bauer sat with her letter unopened. She already knew. The paper was too light, too empty feeling. When she finally forced herself to read, her vision blurred. Her parents had been killed in a bombing raid on Munich. Her younger brother was missing, likely conscripted into what the letter called the People's Militia, old men and boys armed with desperation. The letter was written by a neighbor who ended it with, "Do not come home." There is no home to return to. Elsa read the line again and again until the words lost meaning. She folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and stared at the wall until the evening horn sounded. That night, the mess hall was silent. No laughter, no small talk, no songs. Even the guards felt it, the heavy air of sorrow that clung to every movement. When dessert came, a simple bread pudding, most women left their plates untouched. Lena stared at hers for a long while before quietly pushing it away. "Not tonight," she murmured. "Not ever again," Lieutenant Carter noticed. Later, as the women filed out, he stopped Corporal Novak. "What's happening to them?" he asked quietly. Novak hesitated. "They got their letters. The guilt is eating them alive." Carter frowned. "Guilt for surviving?" Novak nodded. "Exactly that." Over the next weeks, that guilt deepened into something unspoken but visible in every corner of the camp. The women worked longer hours, not out of obligation, but to outrun their thoughts. Elsa volunteered in the infirmary until her hands blistered. Lena stopped eating sweets altogether, passing her portion to others or leaving it untouched. At night, the guards heard faint crying from the barracks, soft, restrained, as if even grief had to be rationed. Private Reed noticed that Marta Klein had begun writing every evening, page after page until her candle burned low. When he asked Novak to translate one of her letters, he was startled by the contents. "She's apologizing," Novak said softly. "To her mother, to her country, to the dead." "For what?" Reed asked. "For being treated kindly." That night, Carter walked the perimeter alone, the desert wind scraping across the fence like a whisper. He couldn't stop thinking about Novak's words. He had come to believe that decency was a simple thing. Follow the rules, feed your prisoners, treat them with fairness. But now he saw it wasn't simple at all. These women were punishing themselves with the very kindness meant to heal them. The next morning, Reed tried something different. He sat with a few prisoners during their break and began telling stories, not about the war, but about home. He spoke of his family's farm, of losing crops to drought, of his little brother who died from pneumonia because they couldn't afford a doctor. He spoke not with pity, but with quiet honesty. At first, the women listened politely, unsure how to react. But when Novak translated, a strange stillness settled over them. For the first time, they saw something familiar in their captors, not power, but pain. That afternoon, Lena approached Reed at the fence. Her English was broken but sincere. "Your brother," she said, touching her chest. "I am sorry," Reed nodded. "Me too." It was the simplest exchange of the entire war. And somehow it meant more than all the letters in the world. That evening the guards noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The women began to hum while washing dishes. Someone laughed quietly. Life, cautious and wounded, was beginning to breathe again. But the shadow of those letters never left. They lingered in every prayer, every unfinished meal, every act of kindness that felt like betrayal. As November drew on, the desert nights grew cold, and the women huddled in their bunks with thin blankets and heavier hearts. Yet somewhere beneath the ache, something fragile was taking root. The faint, impossible idea that perhaps guilt could coexist with gratitude, and perhaps, even in captivity, they were learning how to be free. By mid-November, a different kind of stillness settled over the camp. Not the heavy, sorrowful kind that followed the letters, but one laced with quiet purpose. The women no longer moved like ghosts. They worked, spoke, and even laughed again, though softly, as if testing the boundaries of what was now allowed, not by their guards, but by their own guilt. It began, as most changes did, with something small. Private Reed noticed that the soil behind the laundry shed was damp after every rain, shaded by the building during the hottest hours. One morning, he brought a tin of seeds from the supply truck. Beans, tomatoes, and something else the label simply called summer squash. He set them on the steps where the women would find them. By afternoon, Lena Vogel and Elsa Bauer were kneeling in the dirt, turning the dry earth with spoons and tin cups. They didn't ask permission and none was given, but no one stopped them either. Within a week, almost half the barracks joined in. The women who had once dug trenches in Europe now knelt under the Texas sun, planting life into foreign soil. It wasn't just gardening. It was defiance, a way of saying that even here in captivity, they could create something that belonged only to them. The guards watched from a distance. "You think they're trying to escape?" Reed joked lightly. Lieutenant Carter shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "They're trying to survive." As the garden took shape, so did something else, an unlikely classroom in the mess hall. Sergeant William Fletcher, a quiet man with tired eyes and a teacher's patience, began gathering the women in the evenings. At first it was practical, English lessons using chalk and scraps of cardboard. He wrote simple words on the board: food, sun, work, peace. The women repeated them carefully, laughing at their own pronunciation. But as the nights went on, the lessons changed. Fletcher didn't just teach them words, he taught them meaning. He brought out old textbooks from before the war, maps of the world, poems he had memorized from his teaching days. Through Corporal Novak's translations, he explained what freedom meant in a land where no one listened at your door. It was during one of these lessons that Elsa asked the question that silenced the room. "You lost your son in Normandy," she said softly, her accent thick but her voice clear. "Why do you teach us?" Fletcher paused. He looked down at his hands for a long time before answering. "Because hate didn't bring him back," he said. "Maybe kindness can bring something else." No one spoke after that. The women listened in reverent silence, the weight of his loss binding them together in a shared, wordless understanding. After that night, attendance at Fletcher's lessons doubled. The mess hall became a sanctuary, not of faith but of redemption. Women who had once been enemies now recited English verbs and shared dictionaries made from notebook scraps. Fletcher never raised his voice, never reminded them they were prisoners. To him, they were simply students, and that made all the difference. The Americans began calling the garden the Green Strip, though the women named it Heimatstück, a piece of home. Rows of beans climbed wooden poles like fragile prayers. Every new sprout became a small act of healing. Every harvest a reminder that something good could still grow from destruction. It was there, one afternoon, that Carter found Lena sitting alone, her hands resting on the soil. "You should be proud," he said, nodding at the rows of green. She looked up slowly. "We are prisoners," she said. "But the earth does not know that." He smiled faintly. "No," he said. "It doesn't." The conversation lingered in his mind long after he walked away. He had seen prisoners before, men broken, angry, defiant. But these women were something else entirely. They carried their sorrow like something sacred, and yet somehow they still reached for beauty. By December, word of the camp's strange harmony spread beyond the wire fences. The Red Cross inspectors noted unusually high morale and uncommon cooperation between guards and captives. Local farmers sent gifts, eggs, flour, even a small Christmas tree. On Christmas Eve, Fletcher organized something unthinkable, a joint gathering of guards and prisoners. No uniforms, no ranks, just people. They sang carols in both English and German, the languages weaving together like threads of forgiveness. When the song ended, Carter noticed Lena wiping her eyes. "In Hamburg," she said, "we used to sing the same song during blackouts. We sang to forget the bombs." Reed handed her a small tin cup of cocoa. "Then tonight," he said, "sing to remember something better." For the first time in months, she smiled, not the polite, guarded kind, but something real. Outside, the desert wind carried their voices across the dark plains, mingling English and German into something wordless but whole. For a few precious moments, there were no prisoners, no guards, no sides, only people who had survived the same merciless war and somehow found grace in its ashes. When lights out was called, Fletcher stood alone in the mess hall for a moment longer, listening to the echo of the songs fade. He looked at the chalkboard still covered with words from that evening's lesson, hope, home, tomorrow. He smiled faintly, erased the board, and whispered to the empty room, "Lesson learned." By early May of 1945, the desert was changing again. The air felt lighter, the nights cooler, and the world beyond the fence buzzed with a word that carried both relief and dread: victory. When the radio in the guards' quarters crackled with news of Germany's surrender, the men cheered. Hats were thrown, cigarettes shared, and the long nightmare that had consumed the world finally seemed to be ending. But inside the women's barracks, there was no celebration. Elsa Bauer sat on her cot, staring at the floorboards. Lena stood by the window, hands folded tightly around a letter that had arrived weeks earlier but still felt too heavy to open again. Around them, quiet conversations flickered like small, nervous fires. Victory. For the Americans, it meant going home. For the German women, it meant losing the only home they had left. Lieutenant Carter walked through the compound that evening, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He had expected joy, even tears of relief, but what he found instead was silence, the kind that sinks deep into the bones. When he reached the barracks, Greta Vogel stepped outside, her hair tucked under a worn cap, her face pale but calm. She saluted instinctively, then lowered her hand. "It's over," she said. Her English was still careful but clear. Carter nodded. "Yes, the war's done." She looked out toward the horizon where the desert met the dying sun. "Then why does it feel like something else is just beginning?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. 3 days later, Colonel Bennett gathered everyone in the mess hall. He stood at the front with a stack of papers and a voice that carried the weight of orders too heavy to question. "Ladies," he began, "the War Department has issued repatriation directives. Within the next 2 months, all remaining prisoners of war will be returned to Europe. Transport will begin June 1st. No one moved. The announcement hit the room like a slow collapse. Disbelief, then panic, then quiet devastation. Lena gripped the edge of the table. "Back to Germany?" She whispered to Elsa. "To what? Bombs, rubble?" Elsa didn't respond. Her mind filled with images of her mother scavenging for food, of her brother drafted into a hopeless defense, of letters that stopped coming. For years, they had dreamed of going home. Now the word home sounded hollow, like a place that no longer existed. That night the women didn't sleep. They sat in groups, whispering, some praying, others simply staring into nothing. Outside, a warm wind carried the scent of the garden they had planted, beans, earth, and faint traces of peach blossoms. By morning, a decision had begun to take shape. Greta was the first to voice it. Standing in the center of the barracks, she spoke quietly but with conviction. "We don't have to go back. Not all of us." The words stunned the room. Elsa stared at her. "What are you saying?" "We are prisoners and we have no choice." "Maybe we do," Greta replied. "We have worked here, learned here. We have seen a different kind of life, one without fear, without lies. Germany is gone, but maybe we don't have to follow it into its grave." A silence followed, long and heavy. Then Marta, the one who had first eaten the pie, stood beside her. "She's right," she said. "If home is gone, then we must build a new one." By evening, 11 women had signed a petition, written in halting English, translated by Corporal Novak, and delivered to Lieutenant Carter. It was a request no one had ever made before, permission to remain in the United States. When Carter read it, he didn't know what to say. He brought it to Colonel Bennett, who frowned as he turned the pages. "They're asking the impossible," Bennett muttered. "They're enemy nationals, prisoners of war. There's no precedent for this." "Maybe there should be," Carter said quietly. Bennett looked up at him. "Lieutenant, you've gone soft." Carter didn't argue. Maybe he had. Maybe softness was the only strength that still made sense. Over the following weeks, the camp became a place of waiting. The women who chose repatriation packed what little they owned. The 11 who refused lived in limbo, still prisoners, but prisoners of hope now, not war. Fletcher continued his lessons, though everyone knew they were counting down borrowed days. During one class, Elsa asked him, "If they send us back, what will happen to the garden?" He smiled faintly. "The garden will grow," he said, "even if no one's here to see it." On the final week of May, word arrived from Washington, a reply to Bennett's reports. The government would consider the women's request, provided they found American sponsors and proved they would not burden the state. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. For the first time since the announcement, the women allowed themselves to hope again. Local families who had visited the camp for Red Cross inspections began to write letters of support. Farmers, nurses, even a church group from El Paso offered sponsorship. Word spread quietly that these were not Nazis, not soldiers, not monsters. They were young women who had lost everything and found in a desert prison a chance to begin again. When the final transport trucks arrived to take the others away, the 11 who stayed stood near the fence. They waved through tears as their friends departed, toward homes that no longer waited. Greta clutched a dried peach pit in her hand, polished smooth from weeks of turning it between her fingers. It had become her reminder of that September day, when sweetness had made enemies human. As the trucks disappeared beyond the dunes, she whispered, "We will plant again." Behind her, the garden shimmered in the morning light, green, alive, and growing. July 1945. The desert had changed again. The air still shimmered with heat, but the sky seemed softer now, less harsh, as if even the sun had grown tired of war. The camp that once echoed with orders and marching boots now moved with slower rhythms. The guards no longer carried rifles everywhere. The women walked freely between the barracks and the garden, a small patch of green that had become the heart of the compound. 11 remained. 11 who had chosen not to go back. Colonel Bennett had received the official response from Washington 2 weeks earlier. He'd read the document twice before summoning Lieutenant Carter to his office. "The War Department has made its decision," he said, handing him the letter. "Temporary residence granted under displaced person status. The local sponsors have been approved. They'll stay on for now." Carter read the words slowly, then looked up. "Sir, that's extraordinary." Bennett nodded. "History's full of first times, Lieutenant. Maybe this one will count for something." The news spread through the camp like a whisper at first, cautious, almost disbelieving. Then joy broke through like sunlight after a storm. Elsa wept openly. Greta laughed, a sound that startled even herself. Lena dropped her bucket of water in the middle of the yard and ran to hug Marta, both of them laughing and crying in the same breath. They were not free yet, not officially. Not completely, but they were no longer prisoners either. They existed in the fragile space between worlds, and for the first time, that space felt like possibility. Private Cooper visited that evening, holding a small wooden crate filled with peaches. "Johnson Farm sent their best," he said with a grin. "Thought maybe you ladies should have a proper celebration." When Greta saw the fruit, she froze.